Welcome to Wife Cheating Story. I hope you have an enjoyable and relaxing time listening. Let's get started.
That Thursday night, I laid out the salmon fillets on the counter, their pale pink flesh still glistening under the kitchen light. I rubbed them lightly with olive oil, squeezed a half lemon over their top, and seasoned them as I always had when we were happy: salt, pepper, a dusting of smoked paprika. While they rested, I stirred jasmine rice, watching the grains swell into fluffy clouds before steaming them in a bamboo basket. Over on the roasting pan, I spread diced carrots, zucchini, and bell peppers in olive oil and rosemary, sliding them into the oven so their edges would brown just right. My movements were deliberate, even ritualistic. Each precise step felt like a prayer, a hope that something as simple as dinner could bridge the widening gap between Sienna and me. When I arrived at the table we bought 6 years ago, its oak surface polished smooth by 100 Sunday mornings and late-night conversations, I took in the scene long before she did. The candles flickered in brass holders we chose on our first anniversary, their flame-dancing shadows on the wall. The salmon lay nestled against the rice, the vegetables glowing muted orange and green like embers in a dying fire. I arranged everything carefully, taking a step back to admire the symmetry, as though beauty alone could win her back. Across from me, Sienna sat hunched, her slender frame swallowed by the high-backed chair. The soft hum of her phone screen illuminated her face in cerulean blue, making her eyes look glassy and distant. Her thumb scrolled endlessly, sending and receiving messages I didn't see and didn't want to see. The quiet between us was thick, dense with the weight of unspoken things. I inhaled slowly, tasting the steam of jasmine rice and citrus on my tongue, and reached out, placing my hand over hers in a gesture so familiar that my heart lurched with both longing and dread. Her reaction was immediate. She jerked her hand away as though I'd pressed a red-hot iron against her skin. The plate rattled in my grasp. I swallowed hard, the warmth of the meal suddenly too bright against the chill in the air. "Don't touch me tonight," she whispered, her voice low and hollow, void of anger, carrying only fatigue and indifference. In those 3 words, I felt my pulse slow, my chest tighten. It wasn't fury in her tone. There was no crack of rage or accusation. There was only apathy. And apathy is something more devastating than anger. It is the absence of feeling, the echo of something lost. I watched her profile, pale in the screen's glow, the way her lips parted slightly and her lashes cast faint shadows on her cheeks. I remembered how, months ago, those same lips had curved in genuine laughter when I told a bad joke, how her lashes had fluttered like butterfly wings when I brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. Now the same features felt cold, alien, etched into a memory that had already slipped away. My fingers twitched where they hovered over the table's edge, and I wondered how I could have failed to see the space growing between us, how fast love can turn to absence without making a sound. I sat down, setting the platter gently in front of her, the warmth of the dish bleeding into the thin air. "I thought you might be hungry," I said softly, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. She glanced at the food, her gaze flicking over each component as though reading a menu she didn't care to order from. She didn't speak or lift a fork. The light from her phone bobbed under her chin. I waited, every muscle in me coiled, expecting a refusal or perhaps the slightest acknowledgement. But she stayed silent, her thumb shifting, her eyes fixed elsewhere. The absence of her voice echoed louder than any argument we ever had. I remembered when our disagreements ended with tears and embraces, when friction between us led to reconnection. Now friction led to nothing. No spark. No spark between us, no spark in her eyes. I thought I understood the shape of our relationship, how love could bend and shift, but I had never considered how it could simply slip away, like water through cupped hands, leaving palms empty and skin slick. I pushed the plate closer, a gesture that felt absurdly hopeful. I meant to reach, to draw her attention back to me, to remind her of all the times we sat across from each other sharing meals, sharing stories, sharing dreams. I wanted us to reclaim the gentle hush that settles when 2 people feel safe in each other's silence. But she drew further into herself, her shoulders rounding, as though trying to become small enough to disappear from the world and from me. A tight knot formed in my throat. I swallowed and took a breath, tasting lingering lemon and the faint sting of rosemary in the air. My vision blurred for an instant as the pain of losing her commitment, the finality in her apathy, landed like a brick in my chest. I remembered how we used to share the same fork, playfully feeding each other bites until laughter spilled out. Now she wouldn't even look at the meal I prepared. I withdrew my hand completely and placed it in my lap, my fingers brushing the edge of the table as though I could steady myself against the betrayal of indifference. I picked up my own fork, letting it hover over the rice. I thought about touching the grains with the tines, but my movements felt too heavy, too deliberate. Instead, I laid the fork down again. The candles flickered dutifully, the smoke curling up toward the ceiling, and I realized I was alone at this table, alone in a life we had built together. I closed my eyes for a moment, hearing only the soft whir of the extractor fan above the stove. I opened them and met her gaze, not angry but pleading. "Sienna," I said, voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look up. I repeated her name once more, softer, an echo in an empty room. No response. At that moment, the truth felt as unavoidable as the night closing in around me. Whatever we had, she had already left it behind. And I was the only one still digging through the ruins, trying to find a spark that no longer existed. I sat back, finally letting the silence settle fully between us, and took in the dinner I had made with so much hope. I exhaled, hot and empty, and realized that tonight, the meal I prepared was for me alone. I stepped out into the humid night air, the streetlights casting pools of amber across cracked pavement as if spotlighting my own hidden grief. With no destination in mind, I let my feet guide me, each step a reminder of the emptiness that had become my constant companion. The hush of the neighborhood at this hour felt like a cruel mimicry of the life I once shared with Sienna, serene on the surface but hollow underneath. A faint breeze stirred the scent of freshly mown grass and the distant hum of traffic, and I realized I was breathing in memories with every inhale. On Marlowe Street, the swing set stood sentinel in the small park where, summers ago, Sienna used to perch on my lap. Her laughter had once floated through the air like wind chimes, light and carefree. I remembered the way she'd wrap her arms around my neck, trusting me to catch her mid-flight as she pushed herself higher. Tonight, the swing swayed gently, moved only by the whisper of wind, empty but for the ghost of a child's joy. I reached out to touch the cold metal chain, the links surface-etched by years of weather and use, and I felt the ache of absence settle deeper in my chest. Rust had begun to claim the old frame, and I realized I, too, had rusted from neglect not of my own making but of the love we had both abandoned. I continued down the block, the soft glow of porch lights guiding me past houses that all seemed unchanged except for me. The walls still wore the same coat of ivory paint, the hedges still trimmed into neat rectangles, the American flag above one stoop fluttering dutifully in the breeze. Yet everything looked foreign because the person I used to be no longer belonged here. Each familiar facade felt like a photograph I recognized but could never step into again. I pressed my hands into my pockets, fingers brushing the damp fabric of my hoodie, and wondered if anyone passing by would recognize the hollow shell I had become. Soon, I reached Bernard's Cafe, the place where our arguments and reconciliations had played out over almond croissants and steaming lattes. The neon sign buzzed dimly behind rain-speckled glass, its yellow glow reflecting in the puddle at the curb. I remembered one morning when Sienna and I had sat at the corner table, sunlight slanting through the window in golden beams, and she had reached across to wipe a stray crumb from my lip. Conflict had seemed trivial in that moment, trivial enough to dissolve beneath the sweetness of pastry and the warmth of her hand. I pressed my palm against the cafe's window and traced the outline of the counter where we used to sit, as though trying to draw warmth back into my empty bones. Inside, the cafe was long closed, the chairs stacked on tables, the scent of coffee beans replaced by the stale odor of last night's brew. But I could still see us there. Me laughing after a bad joke, Sienna nudging me with a playful elbow, the barista smiling indulgently at our private world. My throat tightened, and I blinked against the sting of remembered happiness. Every corner of this street held a fragment of the past, a shard of time when our hearts synchronized over simple rituals that now seemed impossibly distant. I rounded the block, head bowed, feet unhurried despite the weight of each memory. The hum of crickets rose from the lawns, a chorus that underscored the solitude of my walk. I passed the little bookstore where she once insisted we buy an obscure poetry collection, the florist who knew our anniversary date by heart. The cracked fountain in the community square where we shared our first kiss under a spray of water droplets that caught the afternoon sun like diamonds. Each step felt like trudging through a museum of our former life, each display case holding an exhibit of what we had lost. But the most piercing realization came when I reached the empty lot at the corner, a place where a house once stood before the developer leveled it for townhomes neither of us ever cared to live in. In the rubble of forgotten foundations and stray pieces of rebar, I saw a metaphor for us. Two people who built walls around themselves until there was nothing left but debris. I crouched down and ran my fingers through coarse gravel, imagining that if I sifted hard enough, I might unearth something salvageable. But all I found was dust. The night stretched on around me. Somewhere a dog barked, a car passed, but none of it broke the spell of my own solitude. I realized I was not angry at Sienna for leaving, not furious at the silent betrayal of her indifference. I was hollow, a shell of hope and memory, exhausted by the ache of unreciprocated love. I could feel the pieces of me cracking, fracturing under the weight of all those shared moments now rendered meaningless. In that breathless quiet, I understood that grief is not a fire you can quench with tears. It is a slow erosion that wears down everything solid until all that remains is an outline of who you used to be. And on those streets that remembered us, I was both archaeologist and specter, uncovering the ruins of a past that Sienna had already abandoned. Yet I continued to walk, every footstep an act of faith that somewhere beyond this grief, I might find a road that led away from remembrance and towards something unknown. I finally stopped at the corner where two sidewalks met. I looked up at the sky, where clouds drifted over a half-moon that offered no solace. I could feel the hollow space inside me, a cavern waiting to be reshaped by new experiences. I closed my eyes and inhaled, tasting the night air tinged with humidity and the faint scent of blooming jasmine. It was then I realized that being hollow did not necessarily mean I was empty. It meant there was room for something new to grow. And so I turned away from the street we once walked together and headed back toward a future I would have to navigate alone. At 4:32 a.m., I slid out of bed as silently as a shadow, careful not to disturb the ragged rise and fall of Sienna's breathing. Moonlight seeped through the curtains in pale shafts, illuminating the rolled-up throw blanket at her feet, one I'd given her on our 3rd anniversary, woven in deep burgundy threads that still smelled faintly of lavender. She lay curled on her side, facing the wall, as if her back could shield her from everything I'd become. For a moment, I lingered there, watching the rhythm of her chest, wondering how we had drifted from midnight whispers to this silent separation. Then I moved, each thought aching with an urgent need to escape the apartment that had become a mausoleum of reminders. I crossed the bedroom and opened my suitcase in the corner, its fabric frayed at the seams, as worn and tired as my own reflection in the hallway mirror. I folded a few of my favorite shirts, ones that still smelled like rain and motor oil from the garage, and tucked them into the case. I chose jeans that had faded to a soft blue, their worn knees a testament to lazy weekends and careless laughter. I packed a pair of clean socks, my phone charger, a toothbrush still sealed in plastic, and my wallet, lean with only the essentials, driver's license, credit card, a few crumpled bills. I hesitated only once, fingering the passport I kept tucked in its sleeve, knowing that I might cross borders tonight and that this piece of paper would both free and terrify me. I paused to look back at the bed, at Sienna's silhouette pressed against the pillow, her shoulders rising and falling in oblivious sleep. Guilt flared like a torch in my chest, but I swallowed it down, replacing it with a taut sense of necessity. I could no longer stay in a place where every breath reminded me of what we had lost and every heartbeat echoed the silence between us. With deliberate calm, I closed the suitcase, fastened the clasp, and placed it next to the front door. In the kitchen, I scribbled a note on a sticky pad in bold. Uneven letters, take care of yourself. No flourish, no apology, no desperate plea. Just a simple wish that somehow hit the mark of finality. I left it on the countertop by the coffee maker, the one she brews with precision each morning, as though even that small ritual no longer mattered. I took a last look around the apartment, the framed photos of us smiling at the beach, our wedding album on the coffee table, the stack of cookbooks we'd once pored over together. I let my gaze linger on each object for a moment, as if to memorize them in case this was the last time I saw them. Then I turned the key in the lock, the click resonating louder than I expected, as though the door itself sighed in relief. Outside in the hallway, the carpet muffled my footsteps, and I felt a peculiar lightness, like I'd shed a heavy skin. The elevator ride down was silent, too quick, and when I stepped into the lobby, its bright fluorescent lights felt harsh. I didn't pause. I kept walking, moving past the mailboxes, past the leasing office with its fake fiddle leaf fig tree that always drooped, and into the night that waited outside. The air was cool against my face, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of a tree limb brushing against a window. I carried my duffel bag, the weight of it familiar and grounding, and kept my eyes on the sidewalk, scanning for a cab or a rideshare that might whisk me away. My heartbeat thrummed in my ears, but fear was swallowed by resolve. I thought of Arlo's garage, the spare couch that smelled of motor oil and solidarity. If I kept going, I imagined the relief of collapse, the world condensing into the narrow rectangle of that sagging mattress. Anything felt safer than the quiet suffocation of our apartment. I found a black sedan idling under a street lamp, its driver tapping on his phone. I slid into the back seat without speaking, placed the duffel at my feet, and gave him the address of my old friend's place. The city blipped by in streaks of yellow and red, stoplights, neon signs, brake lights, and I stared out the window, watching the buildings shift and blur until they became abstract shapes. My mind replayed the nights we used to talk until dawn, voices soft and urgent in the early hours. Now those hours were mine alone, vast and uncharted, and I realized that the departure I feared more than any journey was the one I was making from myself. By the time the driver pulled up to Arlo's garage, clouds were thinning in the eastern sky, and a pale light touched the horizon. The warehouse door was open, its metal frame yawning like a mouth welcoming someone back. Maybe me, maybe someone else wearing my face. Arlo stood leaning against an old pickup, arms crossed, watching the car unfold. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second, not with surprise but with knowing. He waved me over without a word, and I climbed out, the duffel bag slung heavy across my shoulder, my footsteps echoing in the open space. In the dim light, under the crooked shadows of tools hanging on the walls, I felt the first tremor of something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not hope for us to return, but hope that I might find myself again. And in that moment, with the garage door closing softly behind me, I realized that leaving hadn't been an act of surrender, it had been a reclaiming of the person I once was and the man I could still become. I drove for hours under a sky that changed from ink black to the slate gray of dawn, my hands steady on the wheel though my thoughts roared in chaos. The road stretched out before me in long, empty ribbons, the hum of the engine a constant companion to the memories I tried to leave behind. Mile markers clicked past, each one a small triumph. 10 miles, 50 miles, 100 miles. With every passing number, I shed a layer of the man I had been, husband, lover, insider in a life that no longer resembled me. When the sun finally crested the horizon in a pale wash of gold, I realized I felt less like I was running away and more like I was heading towards something I couldn't yet name. Arlo's garage appeared on the outskirts of town without warning, a squat, red brick building with peeling paint and a hand-lettered sign that read Arlo's garage in fading white. Behind it, a rusted chain-link fence enclosed a yard littered with old tires and car parts. I parked next to a pickup truck whose bed was stacked with scrap metal, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment listening to the quiet. No ring of the dinner bell, no hum of conversation echoing through walls. Just the wind rattling an overhead sign and birds beginning their morning calls. Inside, the smell of motor oil wrapped around me like a familiar coat, comforting in its heaviness. Tools hung in neat rows on pegboards, each wrench and socket lying in wait for its purpose. The air was tinged with the scent of rubber and hot engines, punctuated by the faint ozone smell of welding torches. Sunlight slanted through high windows, tracing dust motes that danced in lazy spirals. It was a far cry from the sterile apartment where every corner bore the ghost of Sienna's indifference. Here, amidst the hum of machinery and the promise of tangible work, I felt grounded. Arlo emerged from the back room, his denim shirt streaked with grease and sweat. His hair was a tousle black that refused to stay in place, and his eyes held the same blunt, unwavering gaze I remembered from trade school days. He stopped when he saw me, and in his moment of recognition there was neither judgment nor pity, only acceptance. He tipped his head toward the back wall where a battered couch leaned against a stack of tires. "You want the couch or the cot?" he asked, voice gravelly from years of inhaling exhaust fumes. I paused, looking at the two options. The cot was thin, its metal frame creaking like an old gate when you sat on it. The couch looked more forgiving, though its fabric was stained and worn down to the springs in places. I thought of the nights spent on a cot in cramped dorm rooms, the way my body ached when I woke up cold and cramped. I thought of wanting something softer, even if it meant surrendering to the sag of cushions and unwanted odors. "The couch," I finally said, and Arlo nodded as though he expected nothing less. He grabbed my duffel and set it on the couch seat, then propped two flat cushions to create a makeshift backrest. I peeled off my jacket and draped it over the armrest. The couch smelled of sweat and oil, but also of history, of afternoons spent during slow season swapping stories, of laughter over botched repairs, of the camaraderie that forms when you work elbow deep in engines. I sat down, feeling the springs give under my weight, and a strange calm settled in my chest. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like an intruder in my own life. Arlo puttered around a workbench, humming an off-key melody. He didn't say much, didn't ask me to explain, didn't prod or pry. He simply went about his morning routine, checking oil levels, tightening bolts, listening for the promise of mechanical life in each vehicle that rolled in. Now and then, he glanced my way, offering a nod or a tilt of his head, as though to remind me that I was among friends, that this rough space could be a refuge if I let it. By midday, the garage filled with the clatter of tools and the thrum of engines. I watched Arlo guide a young apprentice through the process of rebuilding a carburetor, his voice patient and precise. I felt a tug in my chest, an echo of dormant purpose. Years of late nights and early mornings in this very environment had taught me the rhythm of machines, the satisfaction of a job done well. I stood up, stretched muscles that had grown stiff from sleeping on the couch, and walked over. "Let me help," I said quietly. His head snapped up, surprise flickering across his face. Then he offered a wry grin. "Thought you'd never ask." We spent the afternoon elbow-deep in grease, my hands recalling the choreography of disassembled parts and recalibrated systems. Each bolt turned, each gasket replaced, felt like a small reclamation of myself, proof that I could still be competent, valuable, worthy of respect. The weight of marital failure and emotional abandonment faded in the face of tangible progress. When the job was done, the engine purred like a satisfied beast, and Arlo clapped me on the shoulder. "Not bad," he said, and that simple praise filled a hollow I hadn't realized was cavernous. As evening approached, the garage emptied out. We stood underneath a single bare bulb, the day's dust drifting in the beam of light. Arlo leaned against the rear fender of the car we'd just finished, and I sank back onto the couch, feeling its springs cradle me. "You're doing good, Jules," he said softly, using my old nickname. I closed my eyes, letting the silence envelop me, punctuated only by the distant echo of the city beyond the garage doors. I realized that this couch, with its motor oil scent and industrial scars, was more than a place to sleep. It was a symbol of solidarity, a declaration that I mattered, even if the world outside had forgotten. That night, wrapped in a thin blanket beneath the low hum of streetlights filtering through the windows, I slept deeper than I had in months. Not because the couch was comfortable, but because for the first time, no one was silently wishing I didn't exist. And in that quiet reaffirmation, I found a fragile beginning for the man I was becoming. 3 days later, I reactivated my phone, the screen lighting up with dozens of missed calls and messages stacked like a pleading tower. I stared at my reflection in the dark glass, haggard eyes rimmed with fatigue, cheeks hollowed by late nights and early departures, and resisted the urge to delete everything. Instead, I silenced notifications and tucked the device into my jeans pocket, determined to control when and how I would hear from her. That evening, rain began to fall in jagged sheets, pattering against the garage's corrugated metal roof like a restless drumbeat. I was under the hood of a customer's sedan when Arlo appeared, wiping grease from his hands on a rag. His brow furrowed as he glanced down the street, then back at me, muscles in his jaw working as if he were chewing on a question he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. Finally, he nodded toward the open garage door, and I saw her standing there, wet hair plastered to her temples, shoulders slumped under a soaked trench coat, eyes pleading under the halo of the neon sign. My heart thumped so loudly I thought Arlo might hear it, but he just tilted his head. I closed the hood and stepped away from the car, boots crunching on the oil-spattered concrete. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by distance and the weight of her own regret. Her gaze flicked toward the workbench where I stood, and something in her face cracked, an unguarded moment of vulnerability that both pulled me in and held me at arm's length. "Is Julian here?" Her voice was soft, but it cut through the garage's hum like glass. She searched Arlo's face, eyes bright with unshed tears. "She's asking for me," I said, using her preferred pronoun for the first time since we parted. It felt strange and final to speak my name aloud in her presence. Arlo crossed his arms, protecting both of us with the quiet solidarity he'd already offered me. He stepped aside, letting her see me clear as day. I took a breath and met her gaze, steadying every muscle against the swirl of memories threatening to surface. She hesitated for a beat, then took a tentative step forward. Rain dripped from the brim of her coat, soaking the garage floor beneath her. "I'm sorry," she said, voice cracking on the apology. "I never meant to push you away." I studied her as she spoke, drinking in the tremor in her lips, the shake in her hands. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, shivering despite the warmth inside. The sight of her pain stirred something in me, an echo of the love I once harbored, of late-night conversations and shared dreams, but I caught it before it roared back to life. I was just tired, she continued, stirring the air with a single finger as though she needed to move to stay upright. Tired of everything, tired of us, tired of pretending nothing was wrong. Her words fell like raindrops, each one pattering on the surface of something I no longer felt. Tired doesn't excuse how you treated me, I said quietly, letting the weight of that fact settle between us. The garage's ambient noises, the hiss of air hoses, the drip of water from the roof, melted into background hush. I saw her swallow, eyes widening with the realization that her excuses no longer held power over me. She closed her mouth, guilt and longing mingling in her expression. I know, she whispered. And I'm sorry. Can we talk? I felt the familiar tug of hope, the urge to fold my loneliness into her remorse, to reclaim what we lost. But the hurt had calcified into something stronger than longing. It had become the foundation upon which I rebuilt my life these past days. Each workshop task, each night on the worn couch, each sunrise I greeted without her shadow looming beside me. I'm not who I was, I said, voice steady. I glanced at Arlo, whose nod gave me permission to end this. I turned back to Sienna. I left because I needed to find myself again. I'm not out here waiting to be your safety net. Her face crumpled, tears finally spilling free. Please, she pleaded, stepping forward despite the rain, despite the barrier I raised between us. I thought I'd lost you forever. You did lose me, I replied, surprised by the calm certainty in my own words. I had to disappear for a while so I could remember that I'm more than someone's husband. I'm a man who deserves respect, who deserves to be seen. And last time I checked, you weren't seeing me. Her shoulders shook with sobs, and I softened for the briefest moment, an old habit of mine, reflexive and dangerous. But I caught myself, recalling nights alone when I learned to be whole without her presence. I forgive you, I said, surprising us both, but I can't go back. She sank to her knees in the puddle, rainwater soaking through her coat, and reached out as though to grab my hand, but I kept my arms at my sides. Don't do this, she begged. Don't walk away. I took a slow step backward, boots splashing in shallow water. I already did. I paused at the edge of the engine bay where a half-repaired motor waited, a reminder of why I stayed. Because here, my worth wasn't tied to someone else's love. She watched me, rain washing patterns down her face, as I edged toward the exit. Around us, the garage hummed on, indifferent to our drama. Arlo gave her a sympathetic look before turning back to his work. The remaining customers outside might wait or might leave, but here, in this place of oil and steel, I was free of expectation. I reached the door, the threshold between our shared past and my reclaimed future. I looked back once, saw her crumpled figure, the ache in her posture, the loss etched into every line of her body, and felt no flicker of doubt. Then I stepped out into the rain, leaving behind footprints that vanished in the puddles, and closed the garage door softly on the woman who came knocking. Behind that sheet of metal, I was safe, and for the first time in months, I felt unbreakably whole. I rolled into town just after sunrise, the sky a pale wash of orange and pink that felt like a blank canvas, and parked outside a two-story building with peeling white paint and a faded sign that read Petals and Provisions. Above the entrance hung a rusted bell that chimed dully when I pushed it open, announcing my arrival to a narrow space lined with glass jars of spices and rows of fresh flowers in galvanized buckets. The florist looked up from her ledger, an older woman with silver hair pulled into a low bun, and offered a polite nod before returning to her calculations. In that moment, I realized no one here recognized me. My face bore traces of sleepless nights and hardened resolve, but to them I was just another stranger seeking something new. I swallowed, letting the anonymity settle around me like a comforting cloak. No whispers of that guy who married Sienna, or sympathetic glances, just fresh starts. I rented the studio apartment above the shop from the florist, Mrs. Delgado, who insisted on showing me every nook of the space, from the tiny kitchenette with its chipped tile backsplash to the lofted sleeping area that looked out over the main street. I dropped my duffel on the floor and ran my fingers along the worn hardwood planks, listening to the creak under my boots as though it were an invitation rather than a complaint. Before I could second-guess myself, I retrieved the change from my pocket, just enough to cover the first month's rent plus a small deposit. and asked if she had any recommendations for good work around town. She smiled, handing me the keys, and directed me to a warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, where a small logistics company was hiring. I nodded, thanking her, feeling a flutter of anticipation I hadn't known in months. This place had no memories of me tethered to its every corner, and that was exactly what I needed. The logistics warehouse was a squat brick building with loading docks that rose and fell like the chest of some great sleeping beast. Forklifts hummed inside, and men in safety vests moved crates with trained precision. I introduced myself to the foreman, an imposing man named Sanders whose lined face suggested years of early mornings, and explained my background in warehouse operations. He eyed my resume with a raised eyebrow, noting my previous position managing inventory and coordinating shipments. "You start tomorrow," he said without a smile, then turned back to the bustle of activity. I left my duffel in my new studio that evening and returned the next morning, trading sweat-stained jeans for coveralls, and stepped onto the concrete floor with a sense of purpose that felt foreign and exhilarating. My first shift was grueling, more physically demanding than any job I'd held before, but it grounded me in the present. Every pallet I loaded, every barcode I scanned, was a small victory, a declaration that I could earn my keep with calloused hands and honest labor. I arrived before dawn each day, the warehouse bay doors glinting in the half-light, and raced the sun through endless rows of metal shelves. The routine was relentless. Unload a truck, sort boxes by destination, verify counts, stack them onto a pallet jack. The work was noisy and unglamorous, but it left no room for the ache of absence. At the end of each shift, my muscles ached in a way that felt restorative, as if the pain was burning away the residue of a life I'd fled. Outside of work, I kept to myself. I learned which cafe down the road served the richest espresso, which laundromat had the friendliest attendant, which stretch of the river trail was best for clearing my mind at dusk. I paid no attention when neighbors greeted each other by name. I passed them with a nod and a curt morning, happy to remain a stranger. I blocked Sienna on everything, phone, social media, even the local chat forums, determined to keep her absence from creeping back into my consciousness. At night, I cooked simple meals on the tiny stovetop, scrambled eggs with chives, grilled chicken with sautéed spinach, nothing elaborate, nothing reminiscent of the dinners I once prepared to win her affection. My new dinners were fuel, not ceremonies. On my third week, my phone buzzed with an alert I'd set as a reminder, call home. I ignored it. Then my coffee mug chipped and cracked my lip the next day, drawing a thin line of blood I cleaned up without thought. Each small disruption in my life felt like a milestone, proof that I was present in a reality that belonged only to me. When I collapsed onto the bed at night, the studio above the flower shop silent except for the hum of the refrigerator below, I felt the space around me breathe like an ally rather than a tomb. I had created a boundary between who I was and who I used to be, and every breath I drew felt owned by me. Over time, I found comfort in repetition. On Thursdays, I walked down to the diner for blueberry pancakes. On Fridays, I browsed through dusty volumes at the second-hand bookstore next to the hardware store. On Sundays, I joined memory card nights at the community center. Unsure how to play most games, but enjoying the low-stakes companionship. I introduced myself as Julian, and that name fit better than I expected, unique here, unburdened by the weight of husband, or ex. It was a reset, a rebranding of the self I had nearly lost. In this town with no history, I was free to define my worth by my actions and not by my relationships. One evening, walking back from a shift at the warehouse, I passed the river trail as twilight settled. I paused, listening to the gentle rush of water over stones, and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, there was no ache to unearth memories. There was only the steady rhythm of the current and the steady beat of my heart. I breathed deeply, tasting the mingled scents of damp earth and wildflowers drifting from petals and provisions below. In that moment, I understood that I hadn't left to escape the past. I'd left to find a place where I could grow roots untethered to pain. And here, under the soft glow of the rising moon, I began to plant them. The first morning, I tied my sneakers for a run. My muscles protested as though awakened from a deep slumber. I jogged down the quiet street behind my apartment, the dawn mist wrapping the pavement in cool fingers. Each footfall felt deliberate, a small defiance against the heaviness that had weighed my body and spirit these past months. By the time I reached the river trail, my breath came in steady puffs, and I realized that moving my body was an act of reclamation, each step affirming that I still inhabited this life. A week later, I walked into the local gym, its fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the scent of rubber mats and sweat hanging thick in the air. Kian, the gym's owner and a former Marine with shoulders as broad as my chest had once been, greeted me without a question. He wore an olive green tank top that showed scars from old wounds and a calm intensity in his eyes. "You new here?" he asked, voice gravelly like he'd spent years shouting orders. I nodded and handed him a month's fee. He gave me a short nod, slipped a master key around his neck, and said simply, "Come when you can. No forms, no introductions, just permission to begin." The first time I lifted weights, I nearly dropped the barbell on my chest. My arms shook under the unfamiliar strain, and sweat beaded at my hairline as I forced my eyes to focus on a spot on the far wall. I hated the ache, resented every tremor that reminded me how weak I'd become. But after I set the weights down, a quiet satisfaction settled in my chest, proof that effort yielded change. I returned the next day and the next, and slowly my body began to remember. My grip grew firmer, my posture straighter, my mind sharper. Each repetition chipped away at the residue of self-doubt, forging something solid where uncertainty had reigned. Between sets, I devoured novels, crime thrillers, modern poetry, classic literature, anything that carried me out of my own head for a while. I read in the corner by the water cooler, propped against a pillar, turning pages as the hum of treadmills and clank of weights swirled around me. One afternoon, I overheard two regulars talking about a book club at the community library. I paused by the door, torn between the impulse to remain invisible and the desire for connection. On a whim, I jotted down the meeting time in my phone and showed up the following Wednesday, carrying a battered copy of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's short stories. The library room was modest, folding chairs arranged in a circle, a whiteboard listing discussion prompts, and the soft glow of a desk lamp on a stack of books. 8 people greeted each other like old friends. When I entered, they glanced up, then offered polite smiles. I slid into an empty seat at the back, careful not to draw attention. When the facilitator asked for introductions, I cleared my throat and said, "I'm Julian," my voice quieter than I'd have liked, "and I'm reading A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings." The group nodded appreciatively, and someone passed me a cup of lukewarm coffee. In that room, amid strangers sharing insights and laughter, I felt the first real recognition that I was more than the sum of my past failures. As weeks turned into months, I carved a routine. Mornings at the gym, afternoons at the warehouse, evenings curled up with a book or scribbling in a journal. I cooked simple but nourishing meals, Tuscan white bean soup, stir-fried broccoli with garlic, pan-seared trout with lemon. I thought of salmon dinners and jasmine rice, but those memories felt distant and belonged to someone else's life. My dinners now were unceremonious fuel, eaten at a small wooden table where the only reflection in the window panes was my own. On a chilly Sunday, I caught the tail end of a Little League basketball game at the rec center. The court echoed with squeaks of sneakers and the shrill flashes of refs' whistles. A group of kids, dribbling unevenly, passed a ball between them under the watchful eye of a volunteer coach. I stood by the bleachers, arms crossed, watching Tyrell, a skinny boy with dark curls and a scowl that didn't quite fit his age. He played with a fierce intensity, pivoting sharply, eyes darting as though expecting rejection. Something in his stance reminded me of myself when I first arrived here. I approached the coach, introduced myself, and offered to help. He eyed me skeptically, then shrugged and handed me a spare ball. "You used to play?" he asked. I nodded, recalling the ring of the ball against my palm, the arc of a perfect shot. "Yeah," I said simply. "Let's see what you've got, kid." Coaching those kids became my new anchor. I taught them fundamentals. How to dribble with control, how to set their feet for a free throw, how to communicate on defense. But the most important lesson I shared was the value of presence. When I showed up, no matter if we won or lost, the boys knew someone cared. Tyrell, in particular, bloomed under that consistency. His scowl softened into a tentative grin when I applauded his improvements. After practice, he lingered to ask questions about footwork and range, and I answered patiently, savoring the transformation in his posture. In coaching him, I found a reflection of the man I was becoming: steady, reliable, unafraid to invest in someone else's growth. One evening, after a long shift at the warehouse and a brisk practice at the rec center, I sat alone on a bench overlooking the court. The floodlights bathed the empty floor in a pale glare. I closed my eyes and inhaled, tasting the dust of the floor and the lingering echo of bouncing balls. In that moment, there was no ache for a past life, no longing for a love that had slipped through my fingers. There was only the steady rhythm of my breath, the resolve in my heart, and the knowledge that I was planting roots somewhere she would never walk. I stood, dusted off my jeans, and flicked off the lights. As I walked back toward my apartment, the night air wrapped me in its cool embrace. It wasn't a journey back to who I was, nor a sprint toward a destination I could name. It was simply the next step in discovering who I could become, and that discovery was the most liberating game I had ever played. I was halfway through my cappuccino when I first heard my name, soft but insistent, cutting through the clatter of cups and low hum of conversation in the cafe's early morning lull. I looked up, expecting a barista's question or a greeting from a fellow patron. Instead, there she stood, Sienna, leaning against a high-top table in the corner, her beige trench coat dripping with morning drizzle, faded eyes wide as if she could barely believe what she saw. My heart stuttered, shattering the calm I'd built in this town where no one knew my story. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and warmed milk, of singed foam and sugar. Outside, the wind rattled the panes, chasing wet leaves in spirals across the sidewalk. I'd come here on assignment, covering a small work conference, but I treated the coffee break as a chance to write in my journal, to map the quiet evolution of my new life. I looked down at the page, the indigo script describing strength regained and roots planted, then met her gaze again. She wore the same uncertainty I'd felt on that first night in Arlo's garage, but now it was reversed. She was the stranger, and I was the man she no longer recognized. I stood slowly, folding the napkin under my cup. My legs felt exposed, too eager to carry me toward her or away. With the entire cafe watching the scene unfold, I cleared my throat. Sienna. My voice was calm, measured, precise, the opposite of the frantic plea I'd once issued when I'd begged her to stay. She bit her lip, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. Rain dripped from her hair in rivulets down her cheeks, mixing with a sheen of uncertainty in her eyes. Julian, she began, and the name fell between us like a confession. She stepped forward, hesitated, then stopped as though uncertain the space between us could bear her presence. I motioned to the seat opposite me. Please, I said. Sit. She crossed the floor, her coat brushing against the table, and lowered herself onto the bench. The cushions creaked under her weight. I slid my cup toward her, but made no move to sit back down. The cafe's early crowd had thinned to a few regulars reading newspapers, their murmurs low and indifferent. I took a breath, tasting the foam's sweetness and the tension's bite. You look different, she said, voice tentative. Her fingers trembled on the ceramic mug. I've been trying to find you. I admitted nothing. Instead, I leaned against the table, crossing my arms. I watched her, how the corners of her mouth quivered, how her gaze flicked down at the table's grain, how her shoulders drooped as though she carried more weight now than she ever did before. I'm good, I said simply. My eyes met hers directly. I'm settled. She exhaled, shaky. I know I hurt you. The words came on a whisper, as if confessing dangerous truths. I've regretted leaving you like that every day. She paused, gathering courage. Can we talk? I closed my eyes, recalling the nights of silence that followed her words. Don't touch me tonight. I remembered the cold emptiness that forced me to pack a duffel bag at dawn, that drove me into Arlo's embrace of grease and steel. I recalled the first time I picked up a wrench again and the liberating ache in my arms, the stolen nights of sleep on that motor oil couch, the unfamiliar comfort of my own solitude. I opened my eyes and offered her the same phrase I left on that sticky note months ago. Take care of yourself. My voice was softer this time, gentle, even. She blinked, confusion and hope mingling in her expression. That's it, she asked. Just that. I nodded. No more goodbyes, I said. No more fights, no more tears. Just that. My heart throbbed, but I felt no tremor of longing. I had built something here, an independent life that thrived without her shadow. I drew a breath through my nose, tasting hazelnut syrup and freedom. She set her cup down, fingers tracing the rim. I don't want you to leave me again, she whispered. I see now what I lost. A single rain-streaked light flickered overhead, casting lines across her face. I saw regret etched into her features, but I also saw weakness. The same weakness that once allowed her to withdraw her heart without a backward glance. I thought of the nights I spent coaching Tyrell, teaching him to pass and trust his team, of the mornings I spent lifting weights, forging myself anew. I realized that my loyalty had shifted from a love that abandoned me to a self I refused to surrender. Sienna, I said, voice firm. You lost me when you stopped reaching. I paused to let the words sink in. She swallowed, as though drawing the truth down into her lungs. I found me when I stopped chasing. For a heartbeat, she looked as though she might reach across and touch my hand, but her hand fell back to her lap. She nodded slowly, tears glinting in her eyes. I understand. I offered her a small, sad smile, no bitterness, no animosity, just the quiet acceptance of a path that diverged too far to rejoin. I turned slightly and placed a few bills on the table to cover both drinks. She watched, the weight of finality settling in her gaze. I walked away without looking back, pushing through the cafe door into the wet morning air. The bell above jingled once, then stilled. The rain had eased into a gentle drizzle, the world washed clean and new. I drew in a deep breath and felt the clarity that comes after release, the unburdened sense that I had made the right choice. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, the road before me stretched wide and open, inviting me forward into a future unmarked by the past. And in that moment, under the soft gray sky, I realized that take care of yourself was more than a farewell. It was the gift I had finally given to both of us. I set my duffel by the door on Monday afternoon and crossed the hardwood floors of the rec center with the practiced stride I'd developed over weeks of coaching. The faint aroma of fresh rubber and polished wood filled the air, and the overhead lights gleamed on the glossy court as if beckoning me to step into a new role. I dribbled a basketball twice, feeling its familiar weight and texture beneath my fingers, and realized how far I'd come from the man who once felt unworthy to exist. Here, I was not bargaining for love or begging for attention. I was guiding young players through the fundamentals of a game that taught so much more than how to shoot or pass. Tonight's practice focused on teamwork. I gathered the 8 boys and 2 girls in a loose circle at center court. Their jerseys hung oversized over slender frames, and their sneakers squeaked as they shifted their stances. Tyrell stood off to the side, arms folded, his dark curls bobbing with every impatient sigh. I met his eye and nodded, inviting him in. He slouched forward, mumbled a greeting, and took his place among the others. I sensed his resistance, defensiveness born of fear, the same fear I once carried when I arrived in this town under a different name, convinced that I had to prove my worth. All right, everyone. I began, my voice clear and calm. Today we're working on passing and moving without the ball. If you can't see your teammate, you can't pass to them. So your job is to create space and be ready. I demonstrated with the ball, pivoting on my right foot, faking a drive, then spinning back to face an imaginary partner. The kids watched, eyebrows raised, as though wondering if I would fumble. I shot a grin their way and tossed the ball to Maria, who caught it with wide eyes and nearly tripped over her shoelace. A ripple of laughter chased the tension from the group. We broke into 2 teams for a drill called Give and Go. One player passed, then sprinted to the basket to receive a return pass. I sprinted alongside them, matching their pace, and barked encouragements. Eyes up. Move your feet. Snap that pass. Tyrell stumbled on his first few sprints, panting sharply, but I clapped my hands and called out, again. His shoulders straightened on the next go, and when he caught the ball with a crisp bounce pass, his face lit up with triumph. The circle of coaches, me and 2 volunteers, hooped in unison, and the kids beamed, their chests swelling with pride. After the drill, I gathered them in a huddle. My voice softened. You all did great. Notice how your teammates helped you. That's what makes a team. Showing up, calling for the ball, and trusting each other. You won't always make every shot. You won't always see every play. But if you work together, you'll be stronger than any one of you alone. I scanned their faces as I spoke, some nodding, others leaning in as though soaked by the message. Tyrell met my gaze, and for the first time today did not look away. His eyes held a flicker of gratitude. As practice concluded and parents filed in to collect their children, I stayed behind to pick up stray balls and straighten cones. The echo of bouncing basketballs subsided, replaced by distant chatter and the scrape of chairs being pushed under folding tables. In the softness of that moment, I felt a sense of ownership not of a court or a title, but of the impact I was making. In a town where no one knew my past, I was valued for my presence. I packed away the equipment, my movements deliberate and satisfying, each fold of a cone or placement of a ball a small testament to order and purpose. Outside the rec center, dusk settled over the town with a gentle sigh. I locked the doors and slipped into my car, the familiar hum of the engine comforting. On the drive home, I replayed the evening's highs and lows, Maria's triumphant smile, Jackson's first basket, and most of all, Tyrell's steady gaze. I thought about the boy who reminded me of myself, quiet, watchful, angry, and how he had blossomed simply because someone believed in him. By showing up for him, I had shown up for myself. Back in my studio above the flower shop, the scent of lilies and chrysanthemums drifted through the crack beneath the door. I set my keys on the small table, where a single flickering candle burned in a glass jar, an afterthought from a workshop on candle making I'd attended with Mrs. Delgado. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table, the flame dancing in my reflection. I opened my journal, the pages soft and waiting, and began to write. Today, I coached a team. I watched them learn that opening their hands is the same as opening their hearts. I learned that planting roots means showing up, season after season, regardless of past storms. My hand paused over the paper, and I closed my eyes, letting the memory of Sienna's indifferent touch fade into something more distant than a dream. The ache that once defined my nights had been replaced by the steady contentment of purpose. I thought of the hollow I used to inhabit, and compared it to the fullness of this life, rich with small victories and human connection. I leaned back, exhaling slowly, and let the candle's warmth seep into my bones. Later, I prepared a simple dinner, grilled chicken breast with steamed broccoli, eating at a table set for one. There was no lament in my movements, no ritual of hope that someone might cross my threshold to share the meal. Instead, there was gratitude. Gratitude for solitude that allowed reflection, for a job that provided structure, for a role that gave my days meaning. After dinner, I washed the dishes, the water warm against my fingers, and one by one placed each plate into the rack until the countertop gleamed. I stepped outside onto the small balcony, the night sky stretched overhead in a blanket of stars. The town below was quiet, the only sound the distant chirp of crickets. I leaned on the railing, breathing in the cool air, feeling the coolness settle in my lungs. I thought of inviting Sienna back into my life, but that impulse dissolved like mist. Instead, I felt the solid truth in my heart. I had found something better than nostalgia, better than reconciliation. I had found peace. In that moment, under the silent watch of the stars, I realized that my roots had not grown downward into the earth, they had spread outward into the lives of others, into the fabric of a community that thrived on mutual support. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you," to the night, to the universe, to the version of myself who once trembled at the thought of being alone. I turned and went back inside, the door clicking softly behind me, and carried the candle's light to my bedroom, where at last I slept without dreams of what was lost and instead dreamed of all that lay ahead. I never imagined it would come down to a single whisper, echoing between us like the final note of a song I once knew by heart. That night, I sat on the worn cushions of the couch in Arlo's garage, the same couch that had been my refuge when I first fled our apartment. The low hum of the city beyond the closed doors felt distant, as though I existed inside a capsule of memory and possibility. I cradled a mug of strong black coffee, its warmth radiating through my palms, and let the steam blur the edges of reality. In that soft haze, I replayed the moments that led me here, the dinner she didn't touch, the walks down streets that remembered us, the flight across state lines, the night spent relearning who I was. On the surface, this was a garage like any other. Tools hung in meticulous rows, the scent of motor oil clung to every surface, and the concrete floor bore the scars of 100 projects. But to me, it had become a sanctuary, a place where I rebuilt more than engines. Here, I reconstructed my identity, piece by piece, through the steady rhythm of honest labor and the quiet solidarity of friendship. It was here that I learned the value of presence, the power of showing up for others, and the freedom that comes when you stop chasing love and start nurturing self-respect. A sudden hiss interrupted my reverie, and I looked up to see the garage door slide open a crack. Rain filtered in, sleek streams of silver that traced the door's edges and dripped onto the floor in tiny splashes. Standing there was Sienna, her figure framed by the harsh glow of the street lamp outside. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, the damp fabric clinging to her form, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. For a moment, I thought I might close the door, might deny her this last chapter of our story, but something in the tilt of her head, the way her shoulders slumped with exhaustion and regret, told me this was not an act of reconciliation but of release. "Can I come in?" she asked, voice small, as though she feared I would deny her. The rain drummed a restless tattoo on the roof, and the garage lights cast long shadows that reached toward her like pleading hands. I set my mug down and rose, my boots echoing against the concrete. Without a word, I stepped aside and watched as she crossed the threshold, water pooling at her feet. She held her coat close, eyes downcast, and for a moment the space between us felt as vast as the gulf that had opened in our marriage. I gestured toward the couch where I sat nights ago, same spot where I had found a sliver of peace in the wake of our parting. She hesitated, then sank onto the edge of the cushions, folding her arms around herself as though shielding against the memories that clung to these walls. I remained standing, an observer in a tableau of regret and possibility. The coffee steam curled into the air, and I realized with a curious calm that this moment was not for mending what had been broken, but for acknowledging what had been lost, and for claiming what could never be taken from me again. She looked up, meeting my gaze with vulnerability etched across her features. "I had to see you one last time," she said. Her voice trembled, each word hanging in the charged air. "I needed to know that you were okay." She tucked a strand of wet hair behind her ear, her fingers shaking. "I was wrong, for everything. For the nights I ignored you. For the way I let my own exhaustion become your burden." In the dim light, I could see the lines of fatigue around her eyes, the sag in her posture that hadn't been there before. She had worn indifference like armor, but now that armor lay broken at her feet, revealing the person beneath, flawed, sorry, and perhaps still capable of love. But I had changed. The man she once knew had been dismantled, repaired, and reforged in the fires of solitude and sweat. I had become someone who knew his worth, someone who refused to shrink into the background of another's life. I crossed the floor and stood in front of her, close enough to feel the cool air radiating from her coat, but far enough to guard the space I'd claimed. "You came for closure," I said softly, no accusation in my tone, just observation. Her eyes blinked, moist with regret. She nodded. "I needed to know you weren't destroyed by me," she whispered. "I needed to see you alive." I offered her a small, steady smile, gentle but resolute. "I'm more than alive," I replied. "I'm thriving." I paused, searching her face for traces of the woman I once loved. "I found something better than what I had with you." I found peace. The word tasted sweet and final on my tongue. She swallowed, lifting her chin. The rain slipped down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe it away. "I remember that night you left," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Your note. Take care of yourself." I thought it was cold. I thought I deserved an explanation. But now I realize you gave me the greatest gift, a chance to take care of you and yourself. Her lips trembled. "I'm sorry I never saw your worth until you walked away." My heart fluttered, not with longing, but with the echo of old wounds healed. "Your apology means something," I said, "but it can't change what happened. It can't rebuild what we lost." I stood, extending my hand toward the couch, not to bring her closer, but to bridge the final step in our farewell. She reached out and took my hand, the contact gentle, affirming, and complete. We held each other's gaze in the silence, two souls acknowledging the truth of who we were and who we had become. The rain quieted, the drops slowing to intermittent taps. Outside, the street lamp blinked, and I realized the night was giving way to dawn. The first hint of light stretched along the horizon in a pale line that promised a new day. I felt the heaviness lift from my chest, replaced by a clear sense of closure. Whatever came next for Sienna or me would be untethered from the ghosts of our past. We had reached the end of our story together, and now it was time to turn the page. I released her hand and stepped back, giving her room to rise. She stood slowly, her coat clinging to her form, and tucked a loose curl behind her ear. "Goodbye, Julian," she said, the name I once bore fully, now carried only in memory. I nodded. "Goodbye, Sienna." The garage door opener hung silent and used, as though even that mechanism respected our moment. She walked toward the exit, each step measured and deliberate. I watched her silhouette recede, illuminated briefly by the street lamp before disappearing into the dawn mist. The door closed behind her with a soft click that echoed in the steady quiet of the garage. I stood alone, the weight of her absence settling in, but this time the void felt different, no longer a chasm of grief, but a space defined by possibility. I returned to the couch, sank into its familiar embrace, and lifted the mug of coffee once more. The steam curled upward, and I inhaled deeply, tasting the bittersweet blend of finality and freedom. In that single whisper, she had freed me. And in the silence that followed, I found the peace that lasts beyond goodbyes, beyond whispered regrets, and beyond the boundaries of what once was. With the dawn at my back, I finally understood that true liberation comes not from vengeance or reconciliation, but from the quiet acceptance of who we are, and the unwavering resolve to care for ourselves, always.